Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam in Hilchos Gezeilah v'Aveda, Perek Zayin, Halacha Hey, and Halacha Ches. There's a question that is raised by Achrayim. We know that if a person steals something and denies it, swears that he didn't steal it, and then admits it, he has to pay keren, Chomeish v'asham, the principal, a fifth added to that, and a asham, a carbon asham. So the question is, today we don't have the carbon asham, and if a thief steals and he admits it, he has to repay the keren, the principal, but does he have to give the chomeish? Is that law applied today or not? So the Mefarshim talk about it, the Minchas Chinuch and others, and there's a proof that they bring from the Rambam. In Rambam, Hilchos Gezeilah v'Aveda, Perek Zayin, Halacha Hey, the Rambam says as follows: Gazal ha'av, a father steals, v'nishpa, and he swears, v'haida, and then he confesses. So now he has an obligation to pay the keren, the principal, the chomeish, the fifth, and the asham. But v'achar kach meis, but he dies after he confesses to the crime. Now the heirs, what's their role? Harei hayerish mishalem keren v'chomeish. The heir has to pay the keren, the principal, and the fifth. Obviously, they don't bring a carbon asham, but they do have to pay back the keren and the chomeish, the principal and the fifth. So that would sound like the payment of the fifth is a monetary obligation. It's not a process of atonement like the asham is, like the carbon. And even though you don't bring a carbon asham, you do have to pay the fifth. So that would be it's a monetary payment. So nowadays you'd have to pay it. That's how one could infer, and that's how the Minchas Chinuch infers from the Rambam. The problem is that the Rosh says very clearly that there is no din of paying a chomeish nowadays. The Rosh claims that there is no such obligation, and that's how most Achrayim understand the Rosh. The Beis Yosef does not bring this at all, this halacha, and the Sma says that's because it's no longer relevant. We no longer have that obligation to give the fifth. There's a tshuva of the Avnei Nezer where he brings this proof from the Rambam, which is a Gemara, that the Yarshim have to pay the chomeish, the fifth, and he raises a question. Among the questions that he raises, the Rambam writes a little bit later in Halacha Ches that the carbon and the chomeish l'chapara heim bayim, they come for kapara, and if it's kapara, then it would seem that the obligation does not go over to the children. That's a contradiction to what he said before, that the children do have an obligation to pay the chomeish. But if it's kapara, they don't have any kapara, any need for kapara, just like the asham. But besides that, the Avnei Nezer raises the question that it would seem that if it's kapara, you can't forgo that. In other words, if the nigzal, the victim, says, no, I'm meichel, I forgive you, you don't have to pay me, so it would seem, according to that, it wouldn't help, because the kapara is still needed. He still needs the atonement. But in the Mishnah makes it very clear that you could be meichel. So how could it be l'kapara? If you could be meichel, that means it's a monetary obligation, and a person has a right to forgo that monetary obligation. So the Avnei Nezer says like this, that you do have to bring the asham with the chomeish. And he brings a Rashi, Bava Kama Daf Samach Gimel Amud Beis, that the chomeish doesn't come without an asham. And yet over here we see that the children give the chomeish, but there's no asham. So the Rabbi Eliezer answers it very simply, that as soon as he's maida, as soon as the father confesses to the crime, so the money that he has to pay is a pekad. It's in his possession, that he has to guard it until it's delivered to the victim. And therefore, since it's a pekadon, the obligation was already there, so it transfers to the children. The fact that the Rambam says that it comes l'chapara, he says a very interesting diuk. He says the Rambam's language is very, very distilled. He writes, Chomeish v'ha'asham l'chapara heim bayim. He says, look at his language. He doesn't say shemechaprim, that they atone. The asham and the Chomeish atones. He says l'chapara heim bayim, because the Chomeish is not mechaper. It's not a kapara. But l'kapara heim bayim. Why? Because normally you only pay the Chomeish when there's an asham. When there's no asham, you don't pay the Chomeish. But in the case where the Yarshim have to give the Chomeish, it's because the obligation was already there. It was a pekadon. It was in the possession, in the trust of the father. So that's transferred to the children. So according to this, the halacha would be that since there is no asham nowadays, there's no way to bring a korban asham until Mashiach comes imminently and rebuilds the Beis Hamikdash, and then we'll bring a korban asham. But until that happens, there's no asham. If there's no asham, then there's no payment of Chomeish, because they go together. The only reason why they don't go together in the case of the father dying is because the Chomeish was already owed, and it's now in trust. It's keeping it in trust. That transfers to the children. So therefore, it seems clear, even from the Rambam, that Rambam holds that it's a monetary payment, not a real kapara, but it has to go together with the asham, and therefore, not only does the Rush hold that there's no longer a payment of Chomeish, but the Rambam would also agree with that, according to the Avnei Nezer.